It's a historical forum, and I would like to thank the support through the diffusion and the incorporation of the Ministry of People's Power for Foreign Affairs, for Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza, who is transmitting through the foreign ministry channels for the world to see and listen. The connections are from our embassies in this important fora. It's the first time that we do it at such a high level to dwell on such a specific subject of the situation of our country related to the unilateral coercive measures or the alleged sanctions against our country. As I said, this forum has the intention of informing and to denounce to the country the operations that are being carried out, the legal operations and political operations that are being carried out from the UK, taking the Venezuelan assets, specifically the Venezuelan gold that is deposited in England, in the England Bank, which its institution is just to safeguard Venezuela's patrimony. But unfortunately, due to the political situations that have been happening in our country during the last years, they have decided to keep and not give to Venezuela this patrimony that our country desperately needs, specifically in a moment like this, which is the struggle against the COVID-19 pandemic. Through the political implications, legal, economic, and for all the humanitarian aspects of this aspect that the world is going through, we have decided to call this fora where the president of our monetary authority and the attorney general of the republic are going to go in depth on the subject related to this case and the struggle that Venezuela is undergoing to recover the gold that belongs to all Venezuelans. And we have invited and we thank the embassy from the UK, ambassador, the support for the participation from the UK of the research of Mr. John McAvoy, who we are going to be sharing today. So without further ado, and to present our guests, I would like to give the floor first and foremost to Dr. Calisto Ortega, who is the president of the Central Bank of Venezuela. Dr. Calisto Ortega, he is the president of our monetary authority. He is an industrial engineer. He went to the Sula University. He has a master's degree in finance, and he has a master's of economic policy from the Columbia University. He's part of the honor roll of the Sula University. In the professional aspect, he's been the finance vice president of Citgo. He's been a consulate of Venezuela in New York, as well as in Houston, delegate of Venezuela of the permanent mission of Venezuela to the UN. And by decision and appointment of President Nicolas Maduro and all the authorities and legislative and administrative authorities, he is currently the president of the Central Bank of Venezuela. So I would like to welcome Dr. Calisto Ortega here, and I will give you the floor so that he can tell us from his own words and show us the case of gold and the actions that Venezuela has been doing to rescue this patrimony. Thank you, Deputy Minister. Good day, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity that you provide to the Central Bank to describe all the events that have been related to the struggle of sovereignty of the Venezuelan institutions and of the Republic. This has been, for the Attorney General of Spain, has been an honor and the honor of our lives to say that the interest of the Republic and of our institutions are currently in this hardship time for our homeland are being dealt with. If I had the president of Central Bank of Venezuela in front of me, I would ask him, how would it be? How did you trust the Venezuelan gold to the England bank? How did that gold was in England? And the answer, it's a bit long, because we have to refer to an institutional and commercial relationship that our central banks have with the Bank of England, and that includes the Central Bank of Venezuela. The precious metal market in the world is very concentrated in London, and London, what they call the city, exports services of legal advisorships, support, and specifically this part that the England Bank provides to the central banks of different countries. It's very common that the central banks have gold deposited in the England Bank in order to have access to the precious metal markets. This legal aspect has been, despite from this exception that we have suffered from, is usually very neutral. There is just a few precedents of this, of situations of this sort. We understand that we are the first central bank that has sued the England Bank in courts. It's a bank that has been there for over hundreds of years. And the Central Bank of Venezuela, for some decades, we've had commercial relationships with the England Bank. One of the operations related to the market of precious metals are related to liquidity. So the central banks do financial operations, putting gold as a warranty, like it's called a gold swap, to have liquidity when it's needed. Thus, Venezuela carried out operations with international banking 2013, 2014, when the sanctions were not as strong as they are since the Obama decree. Thus, these transactions placed gold as warranty. And as these transactions reached their maturity, the Republic, in this case the central bank, honored the loans that they have access to. And in this contract of loans, the gold that was in as guarantee that it should have been deposited in the Venezuelan account in England. I am the president of the central bank since June 2018. And when I arrived to the presidency, the central banks had 11 tons of gold that since May of that year were deposited in the Bank of England. And they were deposited because the Central Bank of Venezuela had paid a loan. And with this, they were freeing the gold positions that they had at the time. So we spent several weeks coordinating the repatriation of this gold to Caracas. And the benchmark point of these conversations in 2018, when a delegation of the Central Bank and the Ministry of Finance traveled to London and held meetings with the Bank of England authorities, where we were telling them that we needed to have access to our gold, or to help us sell the gold, because part of the transactions that we had to pay to recover the gold positions that we had They were maturing in December. At the time, Venezuela has deposited in the Bank of England 32 tons of gold. These tons that I've described, 11 of which are part of a payment made in 2018 and another payment made in December 2018 from another liquidity operation that ended up in the deposit of the other 21 tons. The whole process was carried out. It's possible to have access to the position. So we paid through other means our commitment that we honored it. In January 2019, when the year goes by, we see that our relationship with the Bank of England deteriorated. We see that Mr. Guaido had requested to the Bank of England not to give us the gold that was being requested because it was the time in which he stood in the middle of a square and proclaimed himself president of the republic. So after this letter in February 2019, it's a public fact, the political support given to him by the UK government in favor of Juan Guaido. And this added to the problem of communication that we already had with the Bank of England. Afterwards, in March 2019, we continued to insist on having access to our assets, and the Bank of England informed us that they are not going to give us access to the gold and they're not going to follow the instructions that we were giving. And then we had an event that took place. After this few months, the speaker corrected himself. All the documents that they had access to knew that there was a coordination to the United States and authorities of the UK. There's a declaration of Mr. Bolton and talking about the operations in Washington, the Venezuelan gold as the only subject. There's a book that was published a few weeks ago related to someone whose last name was Duncan, if I'm not mistaken. It would have to do with the coordination between the Bank of England and the FCDO, the OFAC, where they were coordinating that we could have access to our assets that is being held in the Bank of England. In April 2019, the government of the United States placed on the list on the OFAC list to the Central Bank of Venezuela. This brought about as a consequence the acceleration of all the transactions that were pending, that were done so in English jurisdiction. And this is where they have the liquidity of the gold that was in warranty. And so in London, we were fighting for our gold and for a liquidity aspect. Another question that I would ask myself if I had the person of central bank and that money that it's in the United States and the Federal Reserves, how come you deposited the money in the United States? Well, that money, after that, the central bank is included as part of the OFAC list and all the contracts that they were being held in London. This was a default event. And one of the banks, specifically the Citibank, arbitrarily took our remaining funds from the central bank. They deposited in the United States in an account that was closed. In our accounts in international banks, it's closed since 2015. I don't know if you remember that in 2015, Venezuela had no more correspondence. In this account that was closed, they reopened it and they deposited the money there. At the time, from 2018 to 2019, we were coordinating with the legal aspect, talking to all the different means, through diplomatic means, legal means, exhausting all the options to try to recover the Venezuelan gold and the assets. When we had the first COVID case in March 2020, we talked to all the banks where we have assets, frozen or blocked assets, raising our voice for humanity, explaining that the need of having access to our funds, and within a pandemic, the Central Bank of Venezuela, as the financial entity of the Republic, needed to have access to payments of medication, medical equipment, and to have a response to the pandemic. Many banks were very flexible. Many banks in Europe were very flexible. But basically, with the only central bank in Europe that we didn't reach and access to our assets was the Bank of England. Thus, in April, trying to find the most flexibility possible, trying to propose a method that made it impossible for them to deny, due to the level of transparency, of coordination with multilateral organizations. We proposed, after coordinating with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the United Nations, that the funds were not given to Venezuela directly, that they were deposited to an account of the UNDP that would help, that through that way we would be able to buy medicine and medical supplies so that we would be able to reach it. And for the surprise of us all, the Bank of England denied this request and denied to follow our instructions. And this is when we had no other choice but to defend our rights in a legal aspect, so in a court, knowing that we are defending something that it belongs to us. It's not something that we have a doubt. So when the first auditing processes and the first sentences began, the part of people, a part of Guaido, they were present in court and said that they are the authorities, both of the Central Bank of Venezuela, as of the Attorney General's office. His name that I don't really recall, I believe Hernandez was his last name, if I'm not mistaken. He stood in court with some lawyers saying that he was the Attorney General of the Republic, and he had received instruction from the Central Bank of Venezuela to represent them. So the court took the position that the first that they had to clarify is who of the two groups that are saying their authority in Venezuela were in fact the authority. And these sentences, they were held at the end of May, and they made the decision in at the end of June. And then, after listening to the arguments, they decided that the team of Juan Guaido was the representative of the Central Bank of Venezuela, against all logics and against everything, against all reality. We are talking about people that do not even live in Venezuela because most of them live abroad. This has to be that a group of people that live outside and then go to a court saying that they are the representatives of the Central Bank of Venezuela, and saying that a court of another country says that they're right. Well, this is exactly what happened. In June 2020, so we appealed the decision. In England, they gave us the right, they appealed the right to give us a prerogative of saying, they told us that we can announce this to the central bank. And when we have this still, then they take out the verdict. So this continues from the Guaido organization. So this has to do with the cost of lawyers, because, and they ask to go back to asking for the case. Guaido's organization requested a permission to the Court of Appeals, and it was granted. So we are currently waiting for these hearings to be carried out. They should be finished by the end of next month. The government of the UK presented to the Supreme Court of Justice a request to interfere in the hearing, and it was granted. And the permit was granted to be part of the case. So we hope to consider that we have a just trial, and whatever is decided regarding was reflect the reality in Venezuela. And the truth is that we only have a single government presided by President Nicolas Maduro Moros and a single Attorney General of the Republic, Dr. Reynaldo Munoz, and there is only one central bank with a body of directors that works on a daily basis for the country and for the Venezuelan economy that is harshly harassed, specifically due to these measures that have duly affected and been imposed on our country. I thank you for the opportunity. I ask you to please keep an eye on this and to echo what is happening, and that the English citizens and the citizens from the UK understand that it's a benefit for England, for the UK, that these institutions, as I mentioned before, the city, the banks, and the Bank of England, and so on, behave in the neutral and just manner in this sorts of aspects, because what is at stake for Venezuela are their assets, it's gold. And what's at stake for the English institutions, it's to lose credibility of being a space that provides neutrality to all the central banks that take the decision of placing in their vaults the assets of their countries. And what guarantees can any head of state of government have, whether it be a prince, a king, prime minister, president of the republic, any head of state of government, that the assets that they are placing in custody are going to be accessible when they need them, and that there is no risk that if somebody stands in the middle of a square of any developing country and self-proclaims as head of state and government, that the UK and its institutions are going to take party in this sort of bizarre things, because there is no technical way of saying this. They're completely crazy. There is too much at stake. For Venezuela, it's very important, but I also believe that for the UK citizens, it's also very important from the decisions that you take, because they will be creating a doctrine of how they're going to handle this situation that are unique and that we have to clarify, and they have to talk about the just, the neutral, the rationality, or they're going to play of what has been happening in the last 2 years. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for to the president of the central bank, Calisto Ortega, for this telling us of the gold in Venezuela. There's been a set of legal actions, of illegal actions, that have compromised the use and the disposition of assets that belong to the Venezuelan people, to its legitimate government, to have access to those resources, including in the time of pandemic. Before giving the floor and go to Calixto Ortega, we are committed to diffuse information to the National Observatory on Unilateral Coercive Measures. I want to say here, before I give to the Attorney General of the Republic, through the networks of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I want to thank once again Minister Jorge Arreaza for the transmission of the world of this forum, from many embassies in Africa and Latin America, through the transmission through our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube channels of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is at cancilleria.ve, which is Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Spanish. We want to welcome the President of the Deputy Ministry of Foreign Trade of Venezuela, and through his direction, I want to welcome him, and that we are creating the National Observatory of Unilateral Coercive Measures with the anti-blockade law. One of this, to have a system that has a follow-up, that does follow-up to these cases, and to give the real and true information to our people and the world about this legal and political process that constitute a defense. And we'd like to thank you for this, and I give the floor to the Attorney General of the Republic, Dr. Reynaldo Muñoz, that I don't have his resume before me. Reynaldo Muñoz Pedrosa is the Attorney General of the the University of Venezuela. He has studies in administrative studies in the Andres Bello University in 2000, 2004 too. He's a legal advisor of the Ministry of Agriculture and Lands. He was Attorney General of 2010. He is the Secretary General of the Ministry of the Council of Ministries, and he was Attorney General, and now is Attorney General since I'm not sure what date it is, so for you to correct me, please. So from 2021. He is the main person in charge of the Attorney General. So since the President of the Central Bank has explained of a false representative that has undertaken in the case of gold, but also the representation of the Republic. So we would like the Attorney General to tell us his analysis of these cases, of these legal assets of a country to justify an economic aggression and to justify a political plan that goes against this country because of the importance of the legal debate at an international level and for the implications that this one has, the case of gold and the rest of the cases that go against the legal actions of Venezuela. We have invited the Attorney General here, so Doctor, you have the floor. Thank you, William. Hello to everyone that is here, and regardless of where you are, that we are here. I want to thank Calixto as well. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today and to give you context a bit of how things have been happening and how things have been working in this legal mess in which we are at a situation where we're currently in, and that we will be free from in the near future, hopefully. Let me comment that while we prepared this presentation, gathering many documents for many years, so we ask ourselves something. There is someone from this group, of a political group of the opposition, and that it does to a commission of the National Assembly, where he talks about walls. And he talks about walls, building walls. Why would he use this euphemism? Why call them walls? And if we understood that the walls were built to isolate the country from its assets, from the international community, that these walls represented for us, but the events of the last few months, maybe of the last 18 months, the struggles within the opposition itself, the denunciation of robbery, of remember the scandal of Petro Paraguay, to mention a few. And all these situations took us to the reflection of saying, why build those walls? Were they to isolate the country, or are they walls of protection of a small criminal organization that has the purpose of taking some Venezuelan assets? And then they build these walls literally to protect themselves. So they join this organization with the US, with international transnational companies, and they have these walls around them to protect themselves. But whether it be for one thing or another, So for Venezuela, these measures dictated by the United States, they say that history will judge them and they will have the justice of those that have been benefited from this. After this doubt, what are these walls made of? Well, these walls are a coordination of a legal aspect. I'm going to refer only. It's a series of measures. Some are measures abroad, and some measures are produced within the national territory. And I say the United States because they are the most important measures, and by the European Union, Venezuela has been sanctioned as well. And they have continued with this persecution of the country. We have formal measures through the UCMs as well. So these measures have executive order. In the case of Venezuela, the 2014 law of the Venezuelan rights and civil population of Venezuela. These measures are going alongside another series of measures that are not formalized. The threats, intimidation, the linking high authorities with heinous crimes, with drug trafficking, and so on. These are the threats of invasion. And then lastly, to take us at war with our neighboring countries. And then the recognizing a parallel government. This has to do what we know of the United States. These measures are done by the United States. So what they do is that they answer them in other states that are in charge of executing these measures. On this side of Venezuela, we capture a political group, and this group has two main tasks. The first one is to have that of the internal order that is linking the measures that's there of states in the United States. And this political group, it has the obligation of creating certain sensation of persecution to guarantee the content in the U.S. measures that exist in the part of the legal advice in the world to see how it's working and to create violence and to have as an end to have a media campaign that in Venezuela there's violation of human rights. Venezuela is attacking the civil population, so on and so forth, and accusing us in the International Court of Justice. So what happens here? There's a huge simulation here, a fraud to the law. And it's complicated to try to identify every single one of the measures of the UCMs. So we have a series of measures that are small formulas to implement the original measure that has been formalized. Since methodologically it's hard to identify them, we have tried to have a characterization on the aspects of having the defense of Venezuela abroad. So they are unilateral, they are dictated by the states. In the case of the United States, for example, without any process, legal one that we can have a right to defense. There is no proof besides media aspects. They signify a threat, sorry, of the strength. Venezuela is not going to comply with them because they don't have any legal binding process in Venezuela. They are based in noble causes according to themselves. They say they're based in democracy, they reduce drug trafficking, so on and so forth. The end of these measures is fully different to those that they search in the Venezuelan case. They talk about the recovery of the authorities in the last declarations. For example, I don't want this government, I apply measures, I take it out, and then I bring a new government abroad that are subject to the foreign policies of the United States, and they follow the guidelines of the government of the United States. In the case of Venezuela, this has been fully clear and obvious. These are measures that are there to punish us, and they disregard international law, obviously. In the case of these measures, they don't respect the free determination of countries because there is a foreign interference where they don't have a legal aspect, and Venezuela has these measures. They have a material effect. The situation of the COVID-19 pandemic, in the case of Venezuela and many countries, the WHO, even some countries and many countries have requested the lifting of sanctions vis-a-vis the pandemic, whereas the formal measures are not legally binding in our countries, but they still have damaging effect on our populations. We have this setting of the Venezuelan case, just to put it in a nutshell. But in other countries, different, the different types of measures different. So the restrictive measures, but in the Venezuelan case, they are joined with an internal accomplices that have increased the effect of the sanctions. See that in the case of the Central Bank of Venezuela, as the president of the Central Bank of Venezuela explained, we can see clearly how they are in with a single means to an end. The BCB is appointed immediately, so they take away the contract. The Guaido's team arrives, as explained, to the legal team of Guaido, saying that they're legitimate, and say that the final payment of the contract, it is to them to receive without having responsibility or any faculty to do so. Just to give it the nuance or in the legal aspect, they go to an arbitrary part, so they go in England when they have all the situation at hand. Here the BCB is here with the only representation separate from the Republic, which is different from the central functioning of the central bank. We are all, we are the whole republic and everything. And that's not an innocent detail that they are doing. Their legal team tries to impose this thesis that we are all together because this is the thesis that working for a client, for you as client, imposes this thesis and manage the capture of Venezuelan assets. I've been giving you context of this so you can see how everything is linked. And to give us a certain type of punishment, or so to speak. But how did we get to this situation? I want to give you a small timeline of what happened in 2008 and what happened until 2015 to have individual measures. Then they were then adopted in 2017. They were individual measures and they were related to the Venezuelan government in general. These measurements were done so in 2014 in an autonomous way. The human rights law of the civil society in Venezuela was applied. So this law is a base to incorporate the new system of sanctions with an executive order that afterwards is added to the Federal Regulations Code of the United States. This closes the legal cycle to have the Venezuelan sanction system that is different in the OFAC page because it has to do with the sanctions. Because this happens until 2015. And it is until 2017 where there's a system of sanctions that looked for the confrontation of Venezuela with the United States. Nevertheless, in 2017, it becomes clearer that there is a new stage, that from that time we had Julio Borges as the president of the National Assembly. So this set a change of policy in how the National Assembly in the United States worked. The previous presidency was part of Ramos Alup's and said that his thesis referred to an internal solution to an internal political conflict. And this internal solution in 2016, we had a lot of activity within the National Assembly and a lot of theses trying to take out the president. It was like a part of, he said that the United States closed this part for the National Assembly. And with the beginning of the arrival of Mr. Julio Borges, this changed a bit. And the people from this new political group thought that the solution was different. They even thought about a military intervention. Then we have the National Assembly, and they can see there that there is still a conflict of the National Assembly. So then the National Assembly declares one of the budgets, applies and asks for the OAS to apply the democratic charter to Venezuela, and they start doing this national and international media campaign. So the United States appoints deputies even of the president of the Supreme Court of Justice that had nothing to do with the decision. They start to sabotage the economic aspect, and then they start buying a series of Venezuelan bonds. And in this time, they have out of the National Constituent Assembly, part of the North American government, so they have the sanctions against this one, and so on and so forth. And there is an important event that happens in 2019, which is a committee of FinCEN that has to do with the banking and financing aspects. It's a political communique, and this is the first official aspect where they criminalize and in a detailed way. It's not only the Venezuelan government, but Venezuelans in general. This notice or communique by the FICSEN not only aspect to the financial blockade of Venezuela, but to many Venezuelans. Many Venezuelans that have their private companies, they closed their accounts got closed as a result. So in 2018, this continues. The OFAC continued with a stronger action. And then the Assembly declares the Petro as something that doesn't work. And then they have, and President Nicolas Maduro is elected as his second constitutional period in January 2019. And this is where the president of the central bank was appointed. And the thesis from the national aspect continue. The abandoning of post and other theses that they dwelt on. This that happened until 2018 is an aspect where the effectiveness of the sanctions was not what the US government expected. When they start giving power to 2009, after 2019, remember then 2019 in January, we had the second presidential tenure of President Nicolas Maduro, saying of that, regardless of this infamous deputy of the opposition, this self-proclamation has this kind of legal craziness where two different governments recognize this, would have two attorney general's offices, two of everything, which was scandalous from a legal point of view. So the central people, like I mentioned, people that were not even living in Venezuela. This had to do with Venezuelan assets and give it to Venezuela. Here you can see how the National Assembly do an effort due to the lack of legitimacy and the support of the United States to all these illegal actions. They appoint all the gold aspect, Minerven, and then Bandes, to all the banks of the public sector. They appoint a bank of which Venezuela was a member of in Russia. So the National Assembly has an agreement with Venezuela. There's a stage where they stop appointing authorities. And they appoint authorities for Central Bank of Venezuela there. For PDVSA, for Citgo. And it was in 2019, the year of the economic coup against Venezuela, which was always very well coordinated. And in 2020, you can see it there. They reduce, they lose strength. What they were carrying out during 2020, OFAC, of course, continues to appoint some deputies of the opposition as a way of punishment. The National Assembly creates some declarations from a political aspect. They appoint the Venezuelan gold of blood gold, and then a media response obviously arises. And they say that there's a company that has a technological platform for this. But if you look at this whole thing happens and gives you context from 2008 to 2021, gives you context of what happens against Venezuela. We fall sometimes in the mistake. Venezuela is a series of sanctions, but this series of sanctions that has had the support during the last few years. There are two important events that will take place that took place in 2021, January 4th. The National Assembly had the Transition Institute, has to do with the administrative processes. This is our law. This one modifies the Constitution and says that this is the law. That the legal aspect and the sentence only rules the statutes. And saying that the powers that they legitimated worked until last year, saying how they're going to be interpreted. This absurd political group, and we have to say it, in a mediocre manner, have carried out strategies for weeks, months, and every time that they reach a blockade, they find a worse solution, a worse and shaming legal solution. This is what the opposition does. We can't do anything about it, honestly. This chronology of sanction allows us to give context why the sanctions to Venezuela are different. What has Venezuela done so far to have the sanctions? As the sanctions, as you know, they are multiple and they have characterization and they're hard to identify. Well, this is not about a legal defense. There has been a diplomatic and a clear diplomatic action. There has been an accompany of heads of state that has been very positive of Venezuela. There has been a media action that has to do with the sanctions at a media level in a relevant way. So we have a chapter for Venezuela. Here we have $400,000 here. $400,000 million, sorry. They were expended in the networks, in the social media, in order to change the law, to do the Venezuelan aspects regarding the aspect of Venezuela at an international level, how it's seen. This has a complex situation. This has a lot of different situations. They're all vetted through the media aspect. From a legal aspect, even though it has been hard to present ourselves in the courts, they don't allow us to contact them sometimes. Nevertheless, this anti-ethical behavior has not been working in the legal aspects as well. The arbitrary courts have rejected this acting. There is not a single court that has accepted the participation of delinquents, of these delinquents. Only one case allowed us to share the defense of Venezuela, which is an emblematic case. And because of the importance of the president of the World Bank had to do in the committee, it is the only case that has we've had the presence of the people from of this criminal group. And in the tribunals and jurisdictions, they have not been able, and then the Federal Court of Justice then rejected the presence of these groups, mentioning as well the Attorney General, where they accuse the lawyer of taking advantage by representing on one side the interest of Venezuela, when months before he was representing the interest of the delinquents. Sorry. So despite the difficulties of the Central Bank of Venezuela, it has to do with the defense of Venezuela. I believe I overtook my time. I will leave some conclusions there and say that these not sanctions, because there is no legal and material justification of this, and there is not an international law norm in which classifies them as sanctions and justifies the sanction. It's a system in where you have invitation of delinquent events of some Venezuelan authorities saying as the declarations that they classify something as a threat to the region. And lastly, we have to understand that we are in a multipolar world. There is no consensus on what are the sanctions, a consensus on the justification of imposing sanctions on Venezuela. So this shows that regardless of the power of the United States has, there is still a multipolar world. Lastly, some reflections we have here. It calls us from a moral and ethic standing of what has happened in the world for that many countries have to do with the implementation of this. This is all I would like to say today. I thank you very much for the opportunity of giving this information in a very short way, and we remain at your disposal to dwell further in depth of the subject. I hope that this pandemic finds you safe and sound at home or at work, and in a short period of time we can overcome it and meet in person. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Reinaldo Muñoz, who is Attorney General of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, for your information. Thank you very much. We've dwelled on this very few, and we go that has deep implication in legal studies in Venezuela and in the world. Because of the nature given that we have a pseudo jurisdiction against the sovereign nation, and we have applied some alleged sanctions without the consent of the United Nations Security Council, which is the only institution that can apply some sort of punishment to a nation. So I will myself because I know that there are some questions here that we're going to do this in a few minutes. We're going to talk a bit with John McAvoy. We want to talk that this information and the chronology that presented both by the President of the Central Bank and the Attorney General are going to be at anti-bloqueo in Twitter, and we're going to transcribe alongside our speakers their interventions, and they're going to be sent to be consulted. I want, before giving the floor to John, I want to salute the huge Venezuelan representatives abroad that are here, and that it's very important, as the Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza said, that the diplomatic missions are informed of this as the real diplomatic representative here, to have the voice of information of the truth of Venezuela in the world. So we have the Venezuelan, Angola, in Equatorial Guinea, in the Republic of Congo, in Barbados, St. Vincent the Grenadines, Hungary, Suriname, Bolivia, Germany, Antigua and Barbuda, Singapore, the Council of Venezuela, in the Canary Islands, and plenty more that I still have not had the information so far. This is a fundamental information having of two high authorities in the countries, and it has other implications as well. We're going to talk precisely now with John McAvoy. Here, will we welcome here to this forum and to this country. The English journalism has played an essential role, not in the legal aspect, but in the aspects of showing what is happening with the policies of the UK to Venezuela. There is a double speech, public policy to express with the UK authorities, and there's a hidden policy as well. This hidden policy has been revealed by social groups, among others, and group of British citizens that have supported Venezuela in this struggle, specifically by John McAvoy. He is an independent journalist whose work has been in the media in the first line in the case of research journalism, as the International History Review, Classified, the Classified UK. These are just a few to mention independent publications that have to do with different processes in the world and that have shown different documents that are unclassified documents and regarding the case of Venezuela in the last few years. McAvoy has an important trajectory known in this aspect within what has to do with his articles on Venezuela and the role of the British government in the political panorama and economic panorama of the country. I'm going to ask those people on chat to please recommend the Twitter account of John McAvoy. There you can see his articles and publications so that we are informed in a better and truth manner on his investigations. So I would also like to thank the participation of the Embassy of Venezuela in the UK, of the colleague Martesa Toro, who I believe that technically is done, and she can interpret of the words of John McAvoy to Venezuela. Thank you very much. John, you have the floor.
Yeah, hi. Hi, William. Thanks very much for that introduction. And thanks for having me here today to talk about such an important issue, really, which is the theft of Venezuela's gold within the Bank of England. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So what I'm going to talk about is behind Britain's decision to freeze the gold. I mean, how this fits into more widely Britain's attempts to destabilize Venezuela and destabilize the government of Nicolas Maduro. on why this is such a significant issue, especially in the present time during the global pandemic, as well as the current economic crisis that is present in Venezuela at the moment, but also in many other parts of the region, as we see major protests in Colombia and Brazil just in the former 2 weeks. So in March 2019, I visited Venezuela for the first time, effectively in between the different coup attempts, the one of the 23rd of January, when Juan Guaido declared himself president, the 23rd of February, when USAID tried to force trucks into Venezuelan sovereign territory, and the 30th of April, where Juan Guaido staged an armed coup attempt in Caracas, in Venezuela again. So, I mean, the sanctions against Venezuela have got much more extreme since I was there, especially more recently, when diesel was refused to be delivered to Venezuela on humanitarian grounds. However, while I was there, I thought it was impressive to see how social movements, social organisations were responding in incredibly creative ways to the economic asphyxiation of Venezuela. So especially in terms of food production, food distribution, mutual aid societies, and many other in many other ways as well. So yeah, I mean, while these efforts were extremely impressive, and testament to the resilience of the Venezuelan population in the face of hybrid warfare on the part of the world's most powerful superpower, the US, and its allies, the UK, and large parts of Europe. It was disturbing that they are necessary, and the country, or the government of the country where I reside, the United Kingdom, bears a significant amount of responsibility for these crises that Venezuela is facing. And this goes back to 2019, when Britain officially froze Venezuela's gold. I mean, Britain was supportive of the coup in 2002 against Hugo Chavez. Britain lobbied Guatemala so Venezuela would not have a seat on the UN. In May 2018 is when the British government really started considering serious economic destruction of Venezuela effectively. So in May 2018, the UK's then Foreign Minister and now the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, announced openly that the feeling I get from talking to my counterparts is that they see no alternative to economic pressure against Venezuela. And it's very sad, because obviously the downside of sanctions is that they can affect the population that you don't want to suffer. But in the end, things have got to get worse before they get better, and we may have to tighten the economic screws on Venezuela. So what you hear Johnson say, I mean, totally explicitly, is the acknowledgement that Britain, the US, and the EU are pursuing a policy of collective punishment against the Venezuelan population. And I mean, as many of you will already know, collective punishment against the civilian population is a war crime under the 1949 Geneva Conventions. And I mean, of course, that's before even mentioning the host of other international crimes that have been committed against Venezuela, especially in the last couple of years, including saber rattling and agitation and meddling in Venezuela's internal affairs. So this brings us to the topic of the day, which is the Venezuelan gold held in the Bank of England. This gold was originally reported throughout the English press that it was only valued at a little under $1 billion. It was totally misreported throughout this entire time. The value of the gold, once again, as you know, is double that amount. It's around $2 billion worth of gold held in the Bank of England. Now, behind this decision, British political officials consistently claim that foreign gold reserves held in the Bank of England are not a matter for the British government. The issue cannot be politicised. It has nothing to do with British political officials. But I mean, documents that have been revealed since then have proven that this is just a categorical lie. So shortly after Guaido declared himself president in January 2019, the UK Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, travelled to Washington. Now, the British Foreign Office is refusing to provide details about the the extent of US pressure to freeze Venezuela's gold, or in fact, any of Jeremy Hunt's meetings in Washington, saying to do so would harm Britain's diplomatic relationship with both the US and Venezuela. However, as Dr. Ortega mentioned earlier, the former NSA director John Bolton overtly admitted that Hunt, and I quote, was delighted to cooperate on steps they could take, for example, freezing Venezuelan gold deposits in the Bank of England so the regime could not sell the gold to keep itself going. So we see that John Bolton, who was, partly involved in the Venezuelan conflict, as well as documents revealed by Bloomberg, showed that Mike Pompeo had also pressured the British Foreign Minister Jeremy Hunt to freeze this gold. And then more recently, we had another admission from Alan Duncan, a former Foreign Office Minister, who claimed that Hunt wanted to use Venezuela as an issue on which we can be as fully in line with the US as possible, because Hunt is out of line on a number of issues such as Syria. So what Alan Duncan was saying here was that at the time when Trump wanted to de-escalate in Syria, to de-escalate from the dirty war in Syria, there's been the most expensive CIA operation in the agency's history, that Britain was deeply and is deeply involved in as well. So Trump wanted to de-escalate from Syria. When Jeremy Hunt said, no, there's no way that we can de-escalate from Syria, the British Foreign Office decided that it needed to escalate its Venezuela policy to placate the United States over the British policy in Syria. So, you've got this kind of overlapping imperialist tragedy that Britain regularly creates, from the Chagos Islands to Iraq to Libya, where certain imperialist interests are used to justify other imperialist interests as well. So, geopolitical concerns, especially with relation to Britain's fading power status, they've been key to the decision to freeze Venezuela's gold held in the Bank of England. But then this isn't the only concern. There are other issues and other interests as well. Britain would clearly like to see the return of British oil corporations to Venezuela, after Shell spent much of the 20th century dominating Venezuela's oil industry. And this, of course, would entail the full privatization of the oil industry, which, we can be fairly confident would be within Juan Guaido's plans for economic reconstruction. And of course, this brings us to another part of British intervention in Venezuela, which was the creation of a secret unit within the Foreign Office dedicated to the reconstruction of Venezuela. So this secretive unit was quite overtly planning for economic reconstruction, which of course would entail the privatisation of key industries to the benefit of British corporations, and British foreign interests in general. Now, the impact of this policy and US sanctions as well for ordinary Venezuelans has been disastrous. And this isn't just my opinion. This is based on the view of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive sanctions or measures. So in her preliminary report, the UN independent expert named Elena Duhan, she urged the UK, as well as the US and Portugal, to seize the sanctions against Venezuela so that the country could buy medicine, vaccines, food, medical and other equipment, spare parts, and whatever other essential goods. Of course, we already knew this. It wasn't. It was very important that the UN report was published, but it wasn't necessary to know that the impact of sanctions had already been disastrous for the Venezuelan economy. The cost of food and medical imports to Venezuela in 2018 was just over 2 billion. The same amount that Britain would very soon after go to requisition. Dr. Munoz spoke a little bit about the media campaigns outside of Venezuela as well. And this is linked to the UN report. The British government didn't even acknowledge the existence of this crucial UN report, and nor did much of the international media. So, you've got the situation we're in at the moment is there's a willful ignorance of what really amount to war crimes. And this is made even more heinous in light of the recent pandemic, which, through a combination of, poor, especially in places like Brazil, vaccine imperialism, and other poor governments elsewhere, the pandemic is currently tearing through Latin America, most affected places in the world. And what makes this even worse, once again, is that the Venezuelan the Venezuelan government's lawyers overtly requested access to the funds in the Bank of England in order to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this request was refused on the very same grounds by Juan Guaido's lawyers based in the UK. Since then, Juan Guaido's former UK representative, a woman named Vanessa Neumann, so she's jumped ship altogether. She's resigned as Juan Guaido's UK representative. And this is perhaps connected to the fact that Guaido's lawyers could not pay their court fees, ironically, because sanctions prevented them from accessing funds that they needed to fight a case to impose greater sanctions against Venezuela. So, a final key point arises. What would be done with this $2 billion worth of gold is handed over to the Venezuelan opposition by the UK next month? Well, we already know that funds taken from Venezuela by the US were used to build Trump's border wall, $601 million worth of requisitioned funds from Venezuela were used to build that racist wall on the Mexican border with the US. And we also find ourselves in a situation where funds requisitioned by the US and Britain from Venezuela could be plugged back into the Venezuelan opposition and used acts that we saw with Operation Gideon last year, whereby a gang of US mercenaries, Venezuelans and Colombians attempted basically to invade Venezuelan territory, commit acts of terrorism and murder, and take over the country. And as we know, these plans were signed off by Juan Guaido himself, who still enjoys US and British governments. Just to add to this isn't the only, the gold is a very important case, but it's not the only of British intervention in Venezuela. As I mentioned, there's the creation of the Venezuela Reconstruction Unit, but there's also been British funding of civil society organisations like Transparencia in Venezuela, which is one of the Venezuelan chapter of Transparency International, which has been intimately tied to funding anti-corruption initiatives in Venezuela that seem directly targeted against the Venezuelan government in order to destabilise it. Now, the UK government could end this shameful episode, which has been going on since at least January 2019, quite easily. So the legal basis for the dispute over the gold is whether the UK legally recognises Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela. If British government policy is simply changed to not recognising Guaido, who is not even no closer to power than when he proclaimed himself president in January 19, he's actually much further away from power. He no longer even has UK representation because she resigned. So the UK government could simply end this ridiculous charade by de-recognising Juan Guaido, working constructively with the Venezuelan government and returning the gold to Venezuela. So to add to this, we're in a ridiculous situation where the UK government is now more committed to recognising Guaido than his own former UK representative or ambassador who quit, once again, Neumann. So yeah, just the final comment, and this is, mostly to people living in the UK, but as responsible citizens, and as Dr. Ortega mentioned as well, it is actually in our interest to pressure our own government to, honour its kind of international law to begin with, but also for the Bank of England to honour the ownership of the assets within it, because otherwise, the Bank of England will lose total credibility as well. So yeah, as the British public is, responsible right now for pressuring the government to cease and desist from these coup attempts in Venezuela and to return the gold. So yeah, I'll conclude there. Thanks very much for having me on this panel, and I look forward to answering whatever questions come.
Periodista inglés, por sus comentarios en relación a, como decíamos, los aspectos políticos que han rodeado y que condicionan todos los debates jurídicos sobre este tema. Esto no se trata de un debate entre posiciones o análisis de distintos abogados o una discusión doctrinal sobre la aplicación del derecho internacional. Esto se trata de una operación política realizada por medios económicos y jurídicos contra una población, contra un país que no ha agredido a ningún gobierno, que no representa ninguna amenaza para los Estados Unidos ni para ningún gobierno de la región, y que tiene absoluto derecho al desarrollo soberano y al uso soberano de sus recursos y activos en el extranjero para beneficio de su población.
Abroad for the benefit of this population. So this has to do with the perspective given this, because it's so important, because it's linked to the political action, the joint political action, and the interest of the United States with the participation of John Bolton from the aggression of 2017 so on, what the Attorney General said, and all the weapons and all the attacks against the Venezuelan economy included. We are in the last part, and we have a limited time for this broadcasting. We have questions, and I want to thank all of those that are participating here and giving their comments. I want to highlight, and we see that we notice that the foreign minister of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, as the Attorney General said, he has defended and has held the voice high of Venezuela to denounce this intervention, to denounce these criminal actions of the state against Venezuela, and to thank the support of the Foreign Venezuelan Service and its interest in this forum, and all the citizens that are here present and are listening to it. The questions that are here, we will answer them written down for the people that give us their data, and I just want to highlight one for the president of the central bank and one for John McAvoy. Cesar Benedetti says to the president of central bank, and Odile Morales says, how much can the Bank of England, from an economic point of view, generate having the funds of Venezuela there? Is there a financial business in retaining the gold, the Venezuelan gold there? I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Calisto Ortega. Any economic benefits that they could have, I believe that the measurement was not an economic one. It was more of a political aspect. So where there would be a great loss for them, as if the Bank of England as an institution would lose the trust of the developing countries, such as Venezuela, and there would be an abrupt drainage from business, because it doesn't have to do with the gainings of the Bank of England, but has to do with the system of the precious metals, with this this with the gold swap financing, purchasing of metals. If this institutionality continues, if this loses the credibility for the clients, this can even measured in points of GDP, what they call in London. I understand that this is an area in the world that produces more money, and that they don't produce potatoes and tomatoes, they have service there. So this is what it's at stake. It's not a matter of gaining for retaining the gold, more because they pushed into the pressures described into these books, and there was a lack of calculation. I limit myself to the opinions in the subjects. But here there was a miscalculation, and it maybe made sense to them to block the international reserves of the Central Bank of Venezuela, so that in the terrain they would have a different reality. But it's been 2.5 years, and the reality remains the same. There is a government, there's a central bank there working, Attorney General's office working, and they are defending the interests of the Republic and governing. Thank you. Dr. Calixto, the Attorney General. Many people ask, you mentioned various cases, you mentioned Citgo, and people ask themselves, what other Venezuelan assets are at risk? We talk about many trials against Venezuela. What other assets and patrimony is at risk due to these legal attacks against the country? In general, the risk situation happens with the United States. This has affected, as the president of the central bank mentioned, some assets done in the Central Bank of Venezuela, but mainly because the United States has a legal thesis according to which their courts take no position regarding the recognition of governments or representations. And then it has the different one from the executive of the country, regardless of the opposition, that it's an illegal one that is outside of international law. This is why Citgo, which is the most known case, is the biggest asset of Venezuela abroad. Got the amount of companies that they've tried to carry out. Besides, Venezuela has other assets. We have numerous. This was a material take of Colombia, different from the United States, has no legislation to apply measures such as those applied by the United States, which was a measure that was not there to take Citgo, but a way that helped the opposition under this argument of a parallel government to take Citgo, not directly the United States, so that when the United States apparently saw the disaster that was in the Citgo administration, they had an order to avoid to sell the assets of Citgo. And I imagine because the attorney that Guaido was appointed there, who was his lawyer, which was a company carrying out, had canalized the U.S. government, and before scandal was better to have a stop. The other case that I mentioned is a different one. Colombia is completely different, has a material positioning. So there's been another one for CV in Spain, which was rejected legally. there has been attempts of taking trials of the Republic abroad. This has been rejected, and they are part of the patrimony, because we have to remember that it's not important to take the assets only, but have to have in this sessions to have a negotiation. So they need to have both of them, the assets and everything. They've tried to make some operations harder, and they try to. So in the rest of the world, what does the opposition, they slow down the processes. In the case of Novo Bank, which was the most media known, with the matter of sanctions, with the representation of this has been slower. So these assets are at risk. I wouldn't think of this as so, because if there has been, on behalf of some executives, the control of these assets, the freezing of the assets, it's very clear that those executives, including the US one, does not trust the political group. They see it as a corrupt group, as an insecure group, that they don't have a real quota of power. So what they've done is to have some set of ad hoc parts, and then they issue requests to the governments where they are present to see if they of sovereignty. What kind of sovereignty is that, if we ask ourselves? So what happens there is what I said they have a simulation. The assets are there, they are frozen, and we to see that they can last in time. Thank you for your analysis. So these things bring about concern in people and the resources of Venezuela. So there has been a de facto damage of the country of using these resources. Let's close this with a question from Alexis to John McAvoy on the political reactions of these denunciations that the UK media has done. Has there been a political reaction from political parties or something? Despite the reaction, we know that in the UK, there is a solidarity movement that is very active with Venezuela. They have different activities where they denounce the Bank of England for taking the gold. And they have stayed in front of the Bank of England. And some of the questions that they have here in comments is, what are the political sector reactions regarding this? John, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question, and it's a good question as well. As you mentioned, the Venezuela solidarity movement in the UK is, among all of them with Latin America at the moment, one of the more prominent. The Bolivia solidarity movement as well was also quite active, especially in response to the coup in 2019. And as you mentioned as well, that same organisation has been involved in organising panels like this one to discuss British foreign policy in Venezuela. There's been a number of protests outside of the Bank of England in London. Aside from that, is there any official political movement that is currently siding with the sovereignty of Venezuela? Well, up until the 2019 general election in the UK, as you probably know, we had Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party. Immediately in response to the January 2019 coup attempt in Venezuela, Jeremy Corbyn publicly said, you know, Venezuelan internal politics are a matter for Venezuelans. They are not a matter for the United States. They are not a matter for the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom has no right to recognise any political figure as the president of a sovereign country. I mean, especially when they've never run in any presidential election. So up until 2019, and we had the, you know, who looked like, you know, come to power, who, you know, had, who was affected, I mean, as anti-imperialist as any political leader in the United Kingdom has any ever been. However, he was, you know, he lost the 2019 general election. There was a lot of internal sabotage within the Labour Party. And now he's been replaced with someone who, you know, who absolutely, we can assume, is not supportive or is not respectful of the sovereignty of Venezuela. Although that said, there are still, you know, members of parliament within the Labour Party, such as Richard Bergen, who has asked questions to, you know, to the government about what the exact nature of British foreign policy in Venezuela is. However, it's, you know, in imperialist core countries like the US, the UK, have a credible anti-imperialist political leadership here that is keeping issues like Venezuela at the forefront of the political agenda, which is a shame. So, I mean, the best avenue for dissent at the moment is through solidarity organisations or journalism, or, you know, that's unfortunately that's as strong as opposition is at the moment in this country.
Gracias, John. Muchísimas gracias por tu respuesta.
Thank you, John. Thank you for your answer. We are finishing this fora, and we want to thank the presence of two high representatives of the government of Venezuela, Calisto Ortega and Reynaldo Muñoz, and of course thank John McAvoy and all the colleagues that have worked in the interpretation, both in London as in Caracas, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Jorge Arreaza, to allowing this space on behalf of the National Observatory of Unilateral Coercive Measures created for the diffusion of relevant information that is adequate to our people and world, to the subjects regarding the blockade and the policies related to this one. This is an event that we're going to broadcast, and the Executive Vice President of the Republic too, so that our people are empowered and can support the efforts of President Nicolas Maduro and the Foreign Ministry and of all the bodies of the state that are defending this in the diplomatic arena and in the symbolic and communication and public area. It has been an extraordinary event. Thank you to our guests. Thank you, colleagues, there in the special one. Thank you, John. We will be broadcasting this material and providing this systematic information, translating them to different languages so that they can be better broadcasted. With this, we say thank you. We thank you, and we thank all the technical teams for being here present. Thank you very much. I declare this forum adjourned.